Hello all, today I will be discussing the portrayal of the Madonna in Florence B. Price's Night. Near the end of her life, Florence B. Price's compositional attention shifted, focusing on pieces requiring fewer musicians. It was nearly impossible to have symphonies and other large works performed without commissions or other sources of funding during post-World War II America. Of these later compositions, 75 were art songs, whose texts were chosen from a prolific assortment of diverse poets, including prominent figures of the Chicago and Harlem Renaissance. These songs have been described by Price's biographer, Dr. Ray Linda Brown, as serious-minded, intelligent, and intense glimpses of Price's inner self. Price's song Night is no exception, offering an empowering, humanizing reading of the Virgin Mary's journey to becoming a mother. In this paper, I will argue that the harmonic structure of this song motivates a narrative of struggle, shown through Schenkerian analysis and a hermeneutic reading of the text. The text of Night was written by poet Louise C. Wallace. Price herself was an avid church organist and studied organ and composition at the New England Conservatory, which could have motivated the setting of this Christian-themed text. Nonetheless, the religious subject of this poem is established as soon as the singer utters the word Madonna. The poem further references the Virgin Mary through its depictions of her rose-red lips and her body clad in scented blue, two colors frequently associated with depictions of Mary. The Virgin Mary has also been heavily associated with night, both in depictions and in Bible verses. Depictions of the Madonna standing on the crescent moon began around 1348, where Jesus is depicted as the sun in the sky, born from Mary, and the moon represents the human race in need of salvation. This depiction of Mary is also associated with a Marian reading of Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 through 5. In merely 5 verses within Revelation, the entire birth and death of Jesus is recounted. Mary is seen in a prophetic vision about to give birth to Jesus in the sky, while a red dragon waits at her feet, the red color of the dragon symbolizing the later suffering and crucifixion of Jesus. Before the dragon can devour her son, God intervenes and takes him to heaven. This Marian reading of Revelation chapter 12 is reflected within Price's setting of Night in numerous ways, including the rather quick depiction of Jesus' entire birth, crucifixion, and ascension to heaven. The first words of the song's text, Night Comes, evoke an image appearing before the speaker, not unlike these prophetic visions appearing before the writer of Revelation. The musical setting of the text gives further depth to these allusions. Perhaps the most astounding compositional feature of the opening 7 bars is Price's establishment of an ethereal, otherworldly atmosphere. Let's listen.
Night comes, a Madonna, clad in scented blue, rose-red her mouth.
The pace at which night comes elicits an image appearing before an onlooker, with the cascading left-hand arpeggios after measures 3 and 4's Madonna, depicting both the terrific scene about to be witnessed and its otherworldly nature, which is aurally inflected through Price's use of modal mixture. In C major, the opening tonic chord moves to flat 6 at measure 4 and 2 half-diminished 6/5 at measure 5. However, in measure 6, Price evokes the color blue using what appears to be a flat 1 chord. The parsimonious voice leading that leads into this non-functional flat 1 chord might suggest a neo-Riemannian analysis would provide insight into this song. The motion between the first 3 chords in particular could be seen as part of a PLR cycle, where the second chord of the cycle is omitted. The presence of this flat 1 chord, however, cannot be explained using triadic neo-Riemannian analysis because it does not fit this opening PLR cycle. Because the neo-Riemannian analysis was not fruitful, I will now try to approach this song from a Schenkerian perspective. I would first like to acknowledge that it seems problematic to impose a Schenkerian reading on a piece written by a black woman, as Schenkerian theory is a theory of hierarchy, and hierarchies in society are used to oppress people of color. Hopefully, my following analysis will allow a narrative of empowerment and humanization to emerge through the interpretation of this problematic flat 1 chord. Perhaps the larger harmonic context surrounding this chord may lend to its interpretation. The first 8 measures of this song feature the Anstieg to the primary tone, scale degree 3, which is supported by a cadential 6/4 chord. One approach to interpreting this flat 1 chord is to view it as a chromatic passing 6/4 chord, where its bass note, G flat, is used to harmonize a chromatic bassline motion, F to G flat to G, from measures 5 through 8, which is concealed through ascending and descending register transfer. However, looking at the surface of the music, it seems as though the music steers the listener away from that interpretation by prolonging this flat 1 chord in measure 6 through measure 7, in combination with a ritardando and diminuendo leading up to measure 8. All of these expressive markings seem to argue against this passing 6/4 interpretation. A more plausible account, given that the final bass note of the arpeggiation in measure 6 is a C flat, the root of the chord, which is carried over underneath the following measure, is that this chord is in root position. The punctuation in the text and the expressive markings at measure 7 together convey an apparent sense of closure on the flat 1 chord. However, measure 7 doesn't sound like a point of closure because the next phrase begins with a cadential motion. In fact, if one were to remove the flat 1 chord altogether, there would be no question that the cadential 6/4 at measure 8 is not the start of a new phrase, but rather a continuation of the previous. Is there any way to reinterpret the flat 1 chord as continuational rather than as a point of closure? In Expanding Tonality, Schenkerian Theory and Beyond, Matthew Brown summarizes Schenker's views concerning the harmonic interpretation of modal inflections in common practice music, arguing that Schenker used tonicization or modal mixture to convey the dominance of the major and minor systems. In her dissertation, Sarah Marlowe builds on Brown's and Schenker's ideas of modal inflection through incorporating Delansky's mixed modes and the Aeolian double-lowered melodic mode. By extending the theory of tonicization and mixture, Marlowe argues that hierarchically, it is possible to introduce altered tonic harmonies as mixture harmonies, including a flat 1 chord, where this chord is deliberately built on scale degree flat 1 and not a means of harmonizing scale degree 7. Through Schenker's views of modal inflections as mixture or tonicization, flat 1 could potentially prove to be a structurally significant harmony and could be treated as subordinate to the original tonic. Following the traditional rules of modal mixture, flat 1 would share the same function as an unaltered tonic chord. However, applying Marlowe's arguments, I would like to suggest that this flat 1 chord is subordinate to tonic and is being used to bridge into the dominant function of the phrase. Upon first hearing this flat 1 chord, one might interpret it as a point of closure. However, retrospective reinterpretation after hearing the cadential motion in measures 8 to 9 justifies the interpretation of this chord as continuational. In fact, Price uses this technique of extending the phrase over seeming points of closure several other times as well, such as from measure 13 to 15, where the previous chord on the voice's word stars is clearly pointing to a resolution to the dominant after a vocal line pause in the middle of the phrase. It is also important to think about the narrative implications of the flat 1 chord. Price's setting of this text in C major evokes a pureness, alluding to Mary's virginity. However, when Price introduces a major chord built on flat scale degree 1, it alters this sense of purity and holiness. While still retaining its major quality, Price conveys a sense of depth underneath this veil of holiness and purity. It is here at this flat 1 chord that Price begins to portray the Madonna as a mother, humanizing her. Viewing this flat 1 chord as a bridge into the dominant function and not as a point of closure conveys that there is more to the story as the listener experiences a destabilization of the tonic. Mary is not simply only the mother of Jesus. She's a thinking and feeling woman who worried about her son's fate just as any mother would. Beginning at measure 8, after reaching the primary tone E5, supported by a cadential 6/4 chord, the dominant function is prolonged for virtually the rest of the piece. Describing the Madonna's eyes as deep in measure 10 could both refer to their color, similar to that of the night sky, or to her eyes allowing one to see deep within, conveying the complexity of the Virgin Mary's thoughts and feelings, as she is also foreseeing the fate of her son right before her eyes, the fiery red dragon that is his inevitable death and suffering. Nonetheless, Mary lights her stars at measure 12, carrying out her duties that she's been called to fulfill, giving birth to the Messiah to immediately witness his death. Here, stars is colored with a 7 fully diminished diminished 4/2 of 5. This connotation of disquietude is further perpetuated through the continued prolongation of the dominant and repeated return of the cadential 6/4 chord, where, in measures 15 through 17, the undulating harmonies of the piano juxtapose root position dominant chord tones against the 6/4 sonorities above the bass, creating dissonance and a sense of unease. This juxtaposition of chord tones foreshadows the eventual and inevitable resolve to the structural dominant, which alludes to Jesus' imminent death. Let's now listen to how the cadential 6/4 is prolonged throughout the end of this piece, starting at measure 8, which is the first appearance of the cadential 6/4. Day, the very last word of the text, can be assumed to be referring to Jesus, both due to its capitalization and the biblical imagery of Jesus being the sun in the sky and literal son born from Mary. The inevitable suffering of the Madonna's son is depicted through the shadow cloaked over the dreamy, sleeping, weary Jesus, burdened by the weight of humanity's sins for which he is about to pay his life. The long-awaited resolve to the structural dominant occurs in measure 25, the voices wearied being scale degree 2 of the Erlinia. This structural weight placed on wearied parallels the weight of humanity's sins for which Jesus must atone, humanizing the Son by showing that he too feels tired. Price's setting of the final bars alludes to Jesus' ascent to heaven, depicted through the vocal line's rise to scale degree 3 instead of continuing its descent to scale degree 1 to complete the Erlinia. Although the resolve to root position 5 is triggered by the depiction of Jesus in the text, it is important to remember that we are seeing Jesus because Mary turns to look at him. Mary is ultimately the main character of this narrative. Thus, the continued prolongation of the cadential 6/4 up to where Mary turns to look at a sleeping Jesus conveys Mary's inner thoughts and feelings, as well as foreshadowing Jesus' fate. Mary here is depicted as a concerned mother who knows she must relinquish her beloved son for the betterment of humanity, but who still feels conflicted and worried about what will happen to him. This humanizing depiction of Mary as a worried mother is also empowering. If Mary hadn't given birth to Jesus, humanity would have no savior. The placement of Mary as the undeniable main character of this narrative is also strengthened by the late reference to Jesus, with day being the last word of text. The listener does not know the source of the Madonna's apparent inner conflict depicted through Price's perpetual prolongation of the cadential 6/4 until the very end of the song, where its long-awaited resolve to root position 5 reveals Mary's concern for Jesus. Price's portrayal of the Madonna as a real woman is best portrayed through a Schenkerian reading of this piece, where prolongation and structural tones of the melody can be shown to facilitate an interpretation both about religion and about motherhood. Further research would look into how Price also portrays her race in this song, as her biographer has stated that these art songs are intense glimpses of Price's inner self. Where I have hopefully been able to show how Price portrays female empowerment, more work needs to be done to show how Price portrays her race and her personal struggles through this narrative as well. I would also again like to acknowledge that it might seem problematic to discuss or impose a Schenkerian analysis on a song written by a black woman, though I have shown that looking at Night through a Schenkerian lens allows a reading conveying empowerment and humanization to emerge. The tension between these two topics, oppression and empowerment, comes to the fore in this paper, and they exist uncomfortably together. This analysis can also provide insight as to how Price utilized harmony to summarize Mary's experience of the birth and death of Jesus within just a single phrase of music, paralleling a Marian reading of Revelation chapter 12. Thank you.